everyone. I'm Jennifer Bird-Poland from the University of Kentucky College of Law, and I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. And I just wanted to take a minute to have a round of applause for our organizer, Anthony Farley, who I think has just done a fabulous job. Brought all these amazing people from all over the country, and we're just really excited to have him here this semester and to have all of you here today. So I'm moderating this panel today on Black childhood and philosophy, and we have 5 distinguished speakers with us this afternoon. Their biographies are all in the pamphlet of materials that you gathered outside, so I'm just going to tell you their names and where they're from, and they're going to present in the order that they're listed in the schedule for today. So first, Professor Sarah Jane Foreman from the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law will be speaking on kidulthood, and then Odina Neal from the University of Baltimore School of Law will be speaking on Black children and American nihilism. Third, Spirit from Texas Southern University's Thurgood Marshall School of Law will be speaking on structural harm in the age of mass incarceration. Next, Phyllis Tate from Florida A&M University School of Law will be speaking on is there a future for, not necessarily the future for Black boys in America, is there a future for Black boys in America? A candid discussion of the education, criminalization, and victimization of Black boys. And finally, Sede Tedla, an LLM candidate at Harvard Law School, will be speaking on freedom, the yet-to-be-realized dream of rural girls in East Africa. So please join me in welcoming our panelists here today. Did you want to turn this on? Yeah.
Good afternoon. It is great to be here. Thank you so much to Professor Farley for including me among these illustrious folks today. It's been a really invigorating day, and especially coming from the conversation we had after Dr. Patton's talk, that was very thought-provoking. And so I hope to contribute a little bit to that. And I think a lot of what I'm going to say has been addressed in previous panels and during our lunchtime conversation. So I'm going to try to move through some of it quickly so that we can leave some room for a discussion at the end, because I know this is our last panel. So my project is called Kidulthood, and really what I'm trying to do in this project is examine the question that really has been the focus of this conference in many ways, is what is Black childhood? And what does it mean to be both Black and a child in America today? And so I think what Professor Patton, Dr. Patton laid out in her lunchtime talk about the social construction of childhood is very important. That is definitely one of the things that I want to discuss as well, and how we construct childhood and how it kind of infantilizes Black youth. And then at the same time, this construction of Blackness and sort of the confluence of these two things, and how young Black people are confined in this confluence. And so they occupy this unusual position in our society because on one hand, you know, they're afforded these limited rights of autonomy that you see in childhood. So you know, viewed as not having certain rights and not granted certain legal rights, but then also paradoxically being cast as adult-like, possessing certain adult-like characteristics. And so on the one hand, we have this infantilization, this removing of autonomy and agency, and then on the other hand, we have this adultification, and these two forces are working on our youth at the same time. And this process, this area that these Black children have to exist in due to these two opposite forces, is what I call kidulthood. So it's the worst of both worlds. It's the worst parts of the way we construct childhood, and then also the way we construct Blackness. So children are robbed of this presumed innocence that society normally bestows upon children, looking at them as you know, docile, cute, irresponsible, but still withholding essential elements of adulthood. So age, in this way, you know, this construction of age is similar to the construction of race and the way they impact the lives of young people. So in my examination of this, I'm starting off by looking at the way childhood is constructed. And I think that we covered some of that at lunch, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that right now. But this idea that we have, this sort of liberal notion of childhood, that children are sort of denied basic rights of the person to be free to make decisions about their lives. They're denied rights of citizenship, such as voting. They're denied full due process rights, such as the right to jury trials. They are denied basic constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. And I think that the point about the corporal punishment of children plays into this, that we can do things to children that would be assault if we were doing them, if we committed such acts on adults. So there's this space, this widespread belief that there's like this objectively appropriate way that children should behave. And when children deviate from this, they are considered out of control. And the capabilities and behavior of children are in this way very much limited. So this applies to all children, but it applies to black children in particular. And then the trade-off that most children would have, that white children might have, so to speak, is this sort of paternal protection that they get out of this deal. So you see the language of what's in the best interest of the child, and the reason why we have to have this kind of paternalism is because children lack wisdom and they're vulnerable, and so we need to protect them. But black children do not benefit from this protection, as we've already discussed to some extent today. And in fact, often these systems that are meant to protect end up being detrimental and causing detrimental outcomes in the lives of young people. So the problem for black children is that because their infantilization, the construction of childhood is not complete, they are often denied these protections. And so, and I'm not even saying that this social construction of childhood is actually a good thing. I think that's a debate for perhaps another time. But the point is that these kinds of protections are afforded to many children, and yet somehow black children are denied them in most circumstances. So, and there's a lot of reasons why they do not benefit from the protections. We've discussed some of that at lunch. There's this sense of blackness and adultification that infringes on this construction of childhood, that children, so they do not benefit from the protective forces of this social construction. This is this area that I'm really interested in. How are these young people able to navigate this space where, on the one hand, they don't have a lot of agency, they don't have a lot of control over their lives, and yet they're viewed as the sort of criminalized adults. This criminalization is part of our social construction of what it means to be black in America. And so black children have this, they're subject to what Michelle Alexander has called the Zimmerman mindset, right? This mindset that view black men and therefore black boys as nothing but threat, good for nothing, up to no good, no matter who they are or what they are doing. And this criminalization, this adultification, is also a product of poverty. It is also a product of abuse and neglect and violence in communities, these things that sometimes give young people this sort of hardened exterior presentation and rob them of these qualities we associate with childhood. I spent the beginning of my legal career as a public defender representing juveniles in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And, a lot of these kids would come into my office and they would have this very tough kind of, or I would be visiting them in the detention center more often than not. They have this very tough exterior. But really, once you got to know them, they're just kids. They're kids. They're just kids. And so they may have been charged with a breaking and entering. They may have tried to steal a car unsuccessfully because they're there in the juvenile detention center. But they're kids at the core. And yet, we don't see that. We see them as these sort of threatening, suspicious criminals. And so what does kidulthood look like? It looks like Mike Brown. It looks like Trayvon Martin and these other historical figures that have suffered untimely deaths, and that their death, this discussion in Ferguson of the unrest and the violence of the protests, without looking at the unrest and the violence of the fact that a young man was killed, that somehow this officer's actions are not violent, that is not unrest, that can happen, but yet these young protesters out in the street are violent and causing some kind of unrest. So I'm going to try to fast forward to some of the things that we can do going forward to deal with this issue, and it's immense, and it's very hard to sometimes think about how can we change cultural narratives, because that's really these are so powerful. How can we change the way we talk about these things and the way these things are portrayed? I think that the presentation about social media, some of the pros of social media, are that we can have some control over how we discuss these things. You see a lot of protesters and activists framing some of these issues on social media, but yet a lot of that doesn't trickle down or doesn't trickle up maybe into the mainstream. So the other thing, and really I'm not going to get into it today because I don't think I have time, but the way that this adultification of black youth happens, and one of the forces that is very powerful in creating it, it's sort of like it's a force that creates it, and then it's like this feedback loop, right, is the way children are treated in the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system. So that's kind of in this project how I'm anchoring it, because you see these young people, arrest rates, the disparate arrest rates, the disparate detention of black youth, and then ultimately the extremely disparate representation of black youth in the transfer decision, the decision to take children out of the juvenile court jurisdiction and put them into adult court jurisdiction. To me, that really represents the ultimate in this adultification process, right? We are now taking this child legally out of the rehabilitative model of the juvenile justice system and treating them like an adult and putting them in an adult prison is what often happens. And that is sort of this ultimate form of bondage that these young people find themselves in because of this process. So I think that there are some ways that we can try to change this narrative, and the discussion about what young people are doing, what activists are doing, is very, very important. I think a lot of these issues are local issues. A lot of the times we're dealing with things, particularly if we're going to talk about school-to-prison pipeline, which is where a lot of this starts. It starts off in the school, it ends up in the prison, is looking at how we can organize around changing the way school boards look at children. I did a lot of representation of children in school discipline cases, and you would go into these school disciplinary meetings, and it's an all-white school board. And the community may be mostly black, but that's who's on the school board. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done on the ground in changing the composition of some of these school boards, because that might affect how some of these decisions are made. Also, addressing this sort of issue of panoptic surveillance that happens in our schools, the way children are constantly viewed as potential threats because there's police officers in the schools. One of the reasons the school-to-prison pipeline has become such an issue in more recent years is because there are actual armed police officers in our schools now. So any little thing that a child does, they're being observed, they're being watched, and they're being punished for what used to be minor infractions that would only result in some kind of in-school discipline. So I think we have to shift the balance of what we're talking about, and really there's a lot of legal strategies. There's data collection. That's another big one. I think if we look at kind of the work of Ida B. Wells and some of the people who were very engaged in anti-lynching campaigns, one of the strategies they used was gathering data. There's not a lot of data on any of these issues, school-to-prison issues, transfer to adult court. We really need that information so that we can take this from a local discussion to a national discussion. And I think these are concrete things that we can do to work in our communities to encourage the juvenile justice administrations to gather these kinds of information, for school systems to gather this kind of information, because using the data to make this not just a local discussion but a national discussion, to put this out there to make people realize how serious the problem is. So those are my suggestions. I have a lot more, and hopefully we can talk about them at the end of this talk. Thank you.
Little danger of my going over my time. And I have to say I was quite surprised when Anthony put me on a panel that was called Black Childhood and Philosophy, because I had never read a word of philosophy in my life. So, except in preparation for this, so this is new. But I want to start with just sort of origin stories. I always think it's important, or at least for me, it's important to talk about where ideas come from. And my idea about this really came from three sources. One is, I am the podcast queen. I love listening to podcasts, and there is a podcast called On the Media that talks about media trends and media reporting. They did a story not too long ago about nihilism and the way that young people are becoming nihilists, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that made me start thinking about how we, who are over the age of 30, may think about the world very differently than people who are 10 or 11 or 12 or 15, 16 or 17. So that was one piece of it. The second part of it is that I have a beloved nephew. I have 3 nephews and a niece, but my oldest nephew is doing nothing with his life, and it makes me very sad. But I've come to learn that he is not the only one who is doing nothing with his life. And although I had once thought that this was a particularly racialized thing, I've come to learn that there are many young men in particular that are living in people's basements, that are working at meaningless jobs doing nothing, although these people at one time seemed to have great promise, seemed that they were going to take on the world, and you have to sort of wonder what happened. Where did all of that energy go? And finally, thought also came to me because I think that a lot of times when we talk about African American children, we forget about the American part of it. And we tend to look at them as if they're in a black vacuum without the rest of the culture having an influence on them. But of course, these are American children, and for those of us who have traveled outside of the country, there is nothing that marks you as American more than black than being outside of these shores. So it's important, I think, to remember that American children have certain life expectations, and I would even say certain materialist expectations that children in other parts of the world may not have. And again, because I lived my life through the media, last night I was even watching an old videotape of Nikki Giovanni, who, in criticizing Bill Cosby 7 years ago, said, why shouldn't our children want Jordans instead of the brandless name sneakers? Why should our kids only have to wear cloth coats when everybody else has a leather jacket? And therein is showing that, again, our children are American children. So all of those things came together for me to make me think about what is going on, or what might at least be going on, in the minds of American young people right now, generally, and African American young children, or young people in particular. So let's start by my very naive definition of what nihilism is, and that is the idea that your most esteemed values really don't mean anything. Or, and to put it in another way, it's like you've had a rug, your life rug, pulled up from under you and there's nothing to replace it. And I fear that right now, that's where young people are. That many of their values and many of their expectations have been pulled out from under them and there's nothing to replace it. And you can see this in a lot of ways. Certainly the economic situation is profoundly affecting all Americans, but young people particularly, because there isn't the kind of expectation that they're going to have a better life than their parents. In fact, they're hoping that they can have as good a life as their parents. They're trying not to slide backwards. So that kind of, this is what I have to live for, or let this be sort of, to help guide me, I can rely on this, that's gone. When they look at the television news, it's as though the entire world is getting ready to explode. There's things going on in the Middle East where there seems to be some new creation of some group that's going to kill everybody soon. You can go to YouTube now and look at beheadings, and that's become sort of a regular part of our discourse now. If you think about the stories about political corruption, a kind of corruption that we used to think perhaps only happened overseas, we now see it happening regularly in this country. And indeed, even when you think about education and what it means to have an education, not only are educational standards arguably slipping everywhere in the country, but now kids are being told not only that they shouldn't go to a place like law school, right? They're also being told maybe you shouldn't even go to college. Maybe it's not worth it for you to do that. Not only is the nihilism seen in those places, I think that it's also seen in terms of the media that kids are consuming, not the social media, but TV shows. For instance, I discovered that the #1 cable show for Americans between the ages of 18 and 49, do you know what it is? It's The Walking Dead. It's a television show about the end of the world, where arguably no matter what you do, it doesn't matter because you're going to die. And there's something clearly about that idea that is drawing people who are younger, because that's the way that they're thinking about the world. Those same kind of apocalyptic narratives are included in a lot of the comic books that kids are reading now, so that there does seem to be this overall sense of, well, how is the world, is that what's left, or is that for real? Oh, Lord. Okay, I lied. Okay. This whole, if the world is ending kind of thinking. So I wanted to focus on, briefly, clearly, 3 different kinds of nihilism. The first is existential nihilism. This is the idea life is meaningless. What does it all matter? And I don't know that at least African American children have ever bought into the life is meaninglessness of that kind of nihilism. And the way that I see that reflected is that even during a time when we used to hear about young kids, especially those involved in the drug trade, who were planning their own funerals and that kind of thing. Well, even planning your own funeral is an indication that you think that there's something important that you want to leave behind, that you want your life to have meaning, even though it may not have. So I don't think that there's that kind of nihilism. But I do believe there's a certain kind of political nihilism that's going on, where you think that political systems and political participation is pointless. And I have to say, when I was thinking about, well, what would reflect that, I honestly think that President Obama squandered a lot of the political hopefulness that existed, and I think that that squandering resulted in the failure of so many people to vote during the last election. And although I know that there are a number of places where voter registration has increased, it really hasn't made a difference in terms of increasing the pool of candidates for office. And indeed, I'll even dare to say that even some of the political participation in a place like Ferguson is really sort of because it's a cool thing to do. I don't know that it's as transformative as we all like to make it out. So I think there's political nihilism, and I also think that there's a certain moral nihilism. Well, what good does it do to do the right thing? What does that get you? And again, looking at TV, when I looked at to see what were the 2 biggest cable TV shows that African Americans watch, they're first The Wire. Wire is number 1, and you remember there's a whole lot of moral ambiguity there, who's right, who's wrong, and even when people try to do the right thing, very often it makes no difference. The second is a show that I've never seen. I think it's called Power or something on Stars. Does somebody, nobody in this room watches television? Okay, great. But it's my understanding that that's also about somebody who's like a good dad. It's sort of like the black Tony Soprano, from what I can understand, except he sells drugs. So I think that one of the things that we have to be aware of then is that an increasing number of children, and that also means black children, are believing that nothing makes any difference. And I think that that's very dangerous, because meaninglessness means that you aren't afraid. But I want children to be afraid, because fear represents a belief in something. You're afraid that whatever that thing is that you believe in will be taken away or can't be achieved. You're afraid of loss when you have fear. And although I'd like to end by thinking about Derek Bell, who said many years ago that he did not believe that there would ever be racial justice in this country, and I think that that may be where a lot of people are now. But the question is, what do you do with the nihilism? What do you do with the meaninglessness? One is you could definitely declare nothing makes any difference, so I can do whatever I want to do. There won't be any real consequence regardless. Or if it means nothing, it means that there's an opportunity to be creative boundlessly. So I think that the challenge then is, if I'm right about this nihilism, to turn that into something creative so that kids won't be bound by thinking they can't do something, but instead by thinking that they can do everything. All right, I'm done now. Thanks.
Thank you all. My name is Spirit. I'm Associate Professor at Thurgood Marshall School of Law. And I want to just begin by thanking Professor Farley for putting this together and the Dean for his hospitality and sponsorship of this conference. I think it's very important. And I've been very much blown away by some of the presentations. So it's very humbling to be here and to participate in this. Also, I know there's a lot of law students in the room. And so I also want to thank you all. I'm sure it's crunch time. You all are very busy. We as law professors like to think we're really busy, but we forget how easy, it's very easy to forget what it was like to be in law school. So very much thank you for coming here. So I'm going to try to tie in a lot of the discussions today and sort of see how it loops around to this thing that I'm talking about called structural harm. Right? And I really want to portray how prisons present different types of dangers, not only to to the youth, but to everyone in certain communities. So the gist of the argument is that prisons have a toxic effect on certain communities over others. So what we have to do is go beyond the individual harms and look at things in a structural way. Right? We need to look at institutional harm. Right? And so the way I do this is I look at this thing called a collateral consequence. And I take a broad view of what a collateral consequence is. So for me, it's not just some operation of law that acts on someone who's guilty or who's been found guilty of a felony conviction. That's part of it, but there's extra legal consequences that I want to get at because some of these are the most invisible and the most harmful. So I take a very broad view, not just the legal, but the extra legal effects. And my main argument is that this affects certain communities over others. It affects underclass communities and makes disadvantaged communities more disadvantaged, underdeveloped certain communities. Okay, I see that, and I'm never going to look at you again. So how did we get here? How did we actually get to this point where we are the world leader in incarceration, both in race and population? We were sort of cruising along in the 60s and then in the 70s automatically. We just started skyrocketing in our prison rates. So how did this happen? Well, I argue, in other words, that the civil rights movement had a lot to do with it. The same people who were marching and struggling for civil rights in the 50s and 60s became the very populations that were incarcerated in huge numbers in the 70s and 80s. That's not a coincidence. It's not that everybody was very happy during, once Brown v. Board of Education came out. What my white daughters can now sit next to a black boy. Loving v. Virginia. People crazy. Now blacks and white daughters can marry a Mexican or a black. So not everybody. Yes. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. So it's not that everybody was very excited about some of these decisions. And so what you had is you had the conscious employment or deployment of the criminal justice system, right, to control certain populations. This is what was done by politicians, right? They started creating some of the longest sentences in the world and applying those and enforcing those in certain communities. So again, I'm really shortening this, but the same people who were struggling for rights became the same populations that were incarcerated in the decades afterwards. So that's the real point. And so it was about taking the color question and turning it into a crime question. That's the trick that was done. It was the bait and switch, if you will. And so the real point that I want to get across from this is that it wasn't about crime control. This was about social control. So what exactly happens, right, when a person either goes to prison or is faced with a felony conviction? Well, at the very beginning in prison, you face all sorts of dangers, from the threat of violence. Right? In federal prisons, the Department of Justice has said you're 50 times more likely to be assaulted. There's all sorts of illnesses in prison that make prisoners more susceptible, right? Tuberculosis, hepatitis, and so forth, all sorts of sexually transmitted diseases as well. And you also have inmates that are coming in with what are called legal financial obligations. So we're talking penalties, restitution, fees, right? Coming into prison with a debt on their shoulder that's going to earn interest and have that interest capitalized. In Arizona and in Washington State, that's at 12% interest. Right? So people are going in with $50,000, $60,000 in fees and in debt, and when they get out, they're at $100,000, $120,000. So it's just massive amounts. And I know some of you in this room are saying, so am I, but the difference is, the very difference is that you're going to have earning power when you're done with your degree. These people come out and they have no earning power whatsoever. Right? So, and then there's mental illness in prison. The prison system, the prisons in the United States collectively are the #1 healthcare provider for mental illness. So more people are being treated behind bars for mental illness, and that is a problem across prison systems because it gets exacerbated, other inmates have to deal with it, and it really makes prisons much more dysfunctional than they otherwise would be. Right? So these are some of the collateral consequences that are in addition to the sentence. Right? Because we think people will get sentenced for a certain amount of time and don't realize what's going on around them during that time. So what happens when they come out? When they come out, they experience what Professor Jack Chin calls the new civil death. Right? The new civil death. You come out, all these collateral consequences, operations of law come and affect you. You can't vote, you can't sit on a jury, you can't do this, you can't work in that job, can't get this license, can't live here, can't get a Pell Grant, on and on and on. Right? So these are the collateral consequences that make it virtually impossible that someone is going to succeed on the outside. Many exit prison with addiction, not having spent any time in sobriety the whole time while incarcerated. Right? So these are the problems that communities are going to have to deal with. And only certain communities, though, because prisoners, when they're released, go back to the communities from which they came. Right? So we have an influx of inmates coming to certain communities. If I could just give a real thin slice of my analysis to think about this when I show you this cycle. Right? So in prison, sexual violence is, in some prisons, it's systemic. And so you have policies that say no sex. And as a consequence, no condoms. So condoms are actually contraband, can get you put in the hole. Right? And so what do we see? We see HIV rates in prison are the highest than anywhere else in the country. Now, let me ask you, where do you think the second highest rates are?
The hood.
The African American communities, the hood, the barrios, right? So African American communities followed by Latino communities have the highest rates of HIV. Right? So this is a direct consequence of some of our prison policies and the fact that the communities are going to be impacted by this much more than other communities are. So when that individual gets out of prison, and we know again from Department of Justice studies, individuals who are sexually assaulted are likely to become sexual assaulters themselves. So the victims of that are the men, women, and children of these communities. They're going to be the victims of recidivist crime or sexual violence. And so when you think about the community gets deflated. There's all sorts of economic costs to dealing with prisons, right? How many of you have ever gotten a call straight from prison? It's impossible because it's always a collect call, right? Because companies have been making money forever, $5 a minute. Right? So have any of you sent money to a commissary account? Right? So you send money, and so there's huge costs, financial burdens. And these communities also suffer from diluted voting power. Right? We have over 5 million Americans who can't vote right now because of felony disenfranchisement. I mean, so just think about it. What do we think the majority people are? African Americans, right? So the voting power gets really weakened, right? Because individuals can't vote, can't sit on a jury duty, right? You can't play the role of a juror. Now just think about how upside down our policy is on this. So we have individuals who come out of prison. We give them no say in the political process. No say for sending this man or this woman to prison, right? So these are the people who know more about the criminal justice system than anybody, and we silence them when they come out of prison. Yet we've got prosecutors and judges and attorneys writing legislation, right, enforcing it and adjudicating. They've never spent one night in jail. That's how upside down our policy system is. And so they're creating, some of the longest sentences in the Western Hemisphere. That's what's going on in our country. So very much upside down policy. And again, these communities reabsorb more than others. So we have it set up, we have it set up such that these individuals are going to fail. It's set up that way. Right? It's set up so that they're unattractive as marriage partners. Right? Who wants to marry this guy? He's got no power to earn any money. He's got all these restrictions. Right? It's just a liability walking around. Right? And these people, there's a handful of feedered counties to every prison in this country. Just a handful of places. And so it's a real cycle. So we set it up for these individuals to fail. And so I'm just running through this. I've got 1 minute left. And so let me just say, again, these are problems that do not even appear on the radar for the rest of the United States. It's concentrated on certain areas. And so I argue that that the prison and the fact of a felony conviction is public enemy number one for minority communities in this country. And so because it was the civil rights movement that got us into this trouble in the first place, right, the backlash, that we need to figure out a way to make the criminal justice system, the cops, the courts, and the correction system, we need to make that the center of a new civil rights struggle, because it has retarded all of the advancements that were made back in the 50s and 60s, right? And it's retarded it so much, we're not even sure of how much the damage is. Right? So thank you so much for your time and attention.
I have a little bit of tech savviness. I think I can figure this out. All right, so the title of my talk is going to be, Is There a Future for Black Boys in America? And this is a candid discussion of the education, criminalization, and victimization of our black boys. So I start this with two things I don't normally do. The first one is, where is it? Well, it was supposed to be first. This is my boy. I put this on here to show you a picture of him the way I see him. And I struggled through my pictures to figure out which one adequately expresses his personality. And I show you this picture for a reason. But before I tell you that, I'm going to do something else I don't normally do. I write poetry. I write poetry for Phyllis. And I don't normally share it. But this one I'm going to share because it has relevance to what we're doing today. And I wrote it the morning after the Trayvon Martin verdict. Well, the case about Trayvon Martin, not his trial. But anyway, the Zimmerman verdict. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, professed by Martin Luther King. But the way you see justice is not the same as my justice. Can justice mean two different things? You see me walking home with my sweet treats, unaware this world is so unkind. What you see is not in fact me, but a thug you've created in your mind. I laid eyes on you, and you on me. On that much, we can agree. I end up dead for something you made up in your head, and in the name of justice, you go free? I ran away, and you gave chase, and a struggle to my death would ensue. But if I were you, and you were me, what differently would you do? So, I shared that with you because that got me on the path to this. And since that morning, I've been trying to find ways to adequately express my frustration and to figure out what I can do, by my fellow tax buddy said this morning, what I can do to make a difference. And so I go back to this photo. I go back to this photo because the boy that I see is not the boy that the education system sees. I have a daughter too. She's 17. I can count on one hand the number of times I've had to go to the school regarding issues with her. And of those handful of things, 2 of them she actually did. All right. And I kind of knew that going in. All right. But for him, the most compliant child of the 2 of mine, the most easygoing child of the 2, I've had to go in a year more times than I have to go her entire school career. And these were for things that he didn't do. In every single case, they were unfounded. I'm only going to talk about one. And this one kind of changed the map of what he does and how he sees the education system as well. He came home, as somebody was talking about earlier, my son was in golf, basketball, flag football, soccer, you name a sport, he's done it or he's at least tried it. But the best one he was at was golf. He's been playing golf since he was able to walk. Okay? And so he was in this golf program after school. Only black boy in the golf program. The teacher presumably loved him. But one day he came home literally in tears after golf. So I have to ask him what's going on. And he said, I got in trouble because this girl said I spit on her. Now, I know this boy. He didn't do that. He didn't even need to tell me he didn't do that for me to know that. But I knew I was going to have to intervene on his behalf. And so I did. And so I went to the golf coach, and I went to the golf coach first, and then I went to the principal of the school, and I said, this has to be investigated because I do not want this on his record, because the next time something happens, you guys are going to say he has this history of this, and so now that justifies this other thing. Well, sure enough, and plus I don't want this girl's dad coming after my son. That was the other thing. They investigate, and here's what they find out. The girl was upset with something that he did. I don't remember exactly what that was, but she was upset with something that he did. And so she got in his face and was talking to him and yelling at him. He responded, she's in the spray zone. So that's how close she is. That's how it got on her. Once she explained it that way, instead of the first narrative that she gave was he spit on me, now the whole thing changes. And now the golf coach is apologetic, the principal's apologetic, but I'm sitting here thinking, had I not intervened, had I not advocated for this boy, you guys already had him labeled as a troublemaker, somebody who had committed an assault on this young girl for no apparent reason. And come to find out, this was really her fault for, 1, getting in his face, and 2, being too close to him. Needless to say, he didn't want to play golf anymore after that. He associated that experience with the playing of golf. And no matter how good he was, and no matter how much that coach wanted him to come back, he didn't go back. I couldn't talk him into it. I couldn't even talk him into a different program. Even to this day, he won't play golf. And this boy, again, there's not a sport he doesn't love, but he won't do that. And I go back to some of the things that we heard this morning. So this gets back to our talk, where the school system from elementary to high school is indoctrinated. It is designed. It is set up so that these boys will get out of the system. Somebody said it very well this morning when she said they put them into the truancy programs. They get them records building at school. They profile them at school to encourage them to drop out. They want schools to be an unsafe place for them, an unhappy place for them, so that they will eventually quit. They won't go to higher education, which leads them to those better career paths and out of jail and out of the system. So if we know that, isn't it our responsibility to do something about that, to advocate for these boys? Now, I think about advocating for my own boy, and I look in that class and I wonder, who's advocating for the others? Is there someone advocating for the others? And for those others, is there a future for them here in America? You're my tax buddy. You're supposed to give me extra time. All right. Anyway. So that said, I'm just going to kind of stream through this because you heard enough about education. And my focus really on this discussion really wanted to be about the victimization. And so that last plug talks about their value being based in school sports. To the extent that they're making money for the university, that's where their investment in universities. but I have a number for you. They represent less than 3% of the college population, black boys, and 50%. Actually, I got that backwards. 59% of the athletic programs. So they predominantly are in school to play sports. Of them, less than half of them actually graduate. So the investment ends with their ability to earn money for the program. So that said, a lot of us are training our boys so that you can go to school on these basketball scholarships. We think that that's the pathway to college when really the education is the key. And if we don't make sure that they're focused on the education, they get lost, and there is no future for them here in America. So now I'm going to shift to the criminalization and the victimization. And I saw this picture actually, and it's so poignant to what I need to say that I downloaded for us, which is, it's not about whether or not the shooter is racist. It's about how poor black boys are treated as problems before they're treated as people. That leads to our criminal justice discussion. We just heard about the pipeline. We heard about pipeline prison this morning, and then what prison does to them and incarceration does to them. And studies show that blacks are more likely to be arrested than white people. Now, you say, well, maybe they're the ones doing the crimes because they're the ones that's in the system. They are disproportionately represented in the system, and they are disproportionately high school dropouts. Now, that's going to lead to my victimization in a minute, but before we get there, I want to talk about the prosecutor's role in all of this, because that affects us as lawyers, that affects us as law students, and that affects us as people who are already out there in the community. We have to have some cultural competence. And I say that with some level of authority, not as a black woman standing up here, because I will tell you that earlier in my career, I was a prosecutor. And as a prosecutor, my focus was winning. It was making sure I had the stats. It didn't even occur to me as a black woman the role that I had in funneling whether or not case went to trial, and funneling what kind of deal this person got, and deciding whether or not to prosecute this cop for the crime that he committed. It was about the win ratio. How likely am I to win this case? All right? So if I, as a black woman, didn't register that when I was doing it, imagine how many other people aren't. Because there's really only one or two of us in these offices. And now, even as a prosecutor, I thought, I can't do this job because I got tired of putting black men in prison. I did. So even as I was not culturally competent at the time, I still felt something wasn't right about it. And then I went to the defense side. And then I realized some of them really are criminals. All right? But not all of them. Of the 10 that were criminals, there were 2 or 3 that weren't, and that's what made it worth it, that I was able to help them. All right? But even that isn't the bulk of what I really want to talk about today. This is. And this slide here was the inspiration for what the primary part of what I wanted to talk about today. It really shouldn't be dangerous to be a young black man. All right? The Department of Justice has pointed out these studies. I got this from the federal government website. All right? So for 100... All right, this is the homicide rate for our males, the black versus the white, in the same age demographics. You can see you're 12 times more likely to die as a young man under 1, and 100 times to 11 more likely to be killed between the ages of 20 to 23 and below as a black man. All right? We've got, well, they're committing the crimes. They're the ones that are more dangerous. But studies also show that if you're a white person, you're more likely to be killed by a white person in regular crimes. I'm not talking about the police-related ones. And if you're a black person, you're more likely to be killed by a black person. So it's not that crossover effect that white people should be worried about. All right? So skipping on to what I really want to discuss is this belief perspective 1 and 2. There's the belief perspective 1, and you know where this comes from. The police have one trigger finger for whites and a different one for blacks. And then the other one, which is, well, black shooting victims are more likely to be caught in a crime, which is why they're the ones who are going to get shot and killed. But I'm going to show you this one. This slide shows 6 white people who committed multiple murders. Each of them were apprehended and tried. The other side shows 6 black people who were not engaged in a crime at all, had not committed any prior crimes, and were all killed except for Jordan, they were all killed by law enforcement. Okay? These guys were in custody, handcuffed, when they committed suicide at the hands of police. These are the names in the last 2 years of young black men who were killed, unarmed, by police. And I had some of the stories to tell you for some of the names that you don't know, because there was obviously a couple of them that you will know. But some of them where the guy was buying a toy gun in Walmart. Okay? So, and one of the young boys who was on the street, he was autistic. They killed him. All right? So it is a dangerous thing for young black boys here in America. And if we're not conscious about it and we're not doing things from our own level about it, how do you expect other people to do something and understand? So we need to be the change that we seek. All right? So I end this with my last slide. Obviously, I'm skipping a lot of stuff, which is there are still two different Americas. When I found this, of course, this goes in with my discussion. You got the white boy saying, I'm going out, Mom, put on your jacket. And then you got the one with the black boy, he's going out, put on your jacket, keep your hands in your pocket, make sure they can see him at all times. Don't make any sudden moves, don't talk to the police, don't shout at the police. All these things we really do have to tell our young boys. That's no joke. I mean, it's very poignant, and it's depicted in a cartoon, but that is no joke. There really still is two different Americas. And so what we can do, what we all should be doing, is making sure we are culturally competent. We are instilling that in our students, and then have our students go out and take over the justice system and be that change that we seek. Thank you. There we go.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. So, how many of you like traveling? And how many of you have been to Africa? Okay, great. So, allow me to take your minds to Africa, a continent across the Atlantic, for a few minutes, which is going to be 10 to 15 minutes. All right. So far, we have been discussing about how black childhood looks like in America and the American continent. So the way I see it, it's more about access, lack of access to opportunities to learn, opportunity to pursue better future, and sometimes, or most of the times, even about opportunity to leave, even to leave. So how about when tradition, society, your own parents, your own relatives deny you of this opportunity to pursue your future? What am I talking about? What does it mean to be a female child in rural East Africa? Black childhood does not end here in America. It's also there in Africa. Let's see what this girl has to say. She is a child bride at the age of 10. She says, when I was 10, my parents arranged for me to marry in the forest. They pretended it was just a party, but it was a wedding, and they sent me away. My mother never told me I was going to get married. They came and took me by force. I cried, but it didn't make any difference. What does this tell you? Wedding, big day for most of the women in the world, but a terrifying moment for rural girls in East Africa, by which they will be tied to a man they have never chosen, they don't know for the rest of their lives. This is a girl, a night before her wedding. And she's crying. She's terrified about what is coming up. And it's not only marriage. There is a prerequisite to be marriageable, to qualify for marriage at a very young age. And that's what we call female genital mutilation, which goes by FGM in most cases. So to rural girls in East Africa, marriage at young age is not only the hardship they would have to face. Tradition also requires that they undergo a very, very painful procedure, which is known as FGM. I think it's giving me a trouble. Okay. Oh, sorry about this. Okay. Let me just go like this. So freedom, giving it a simple definition of the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved, liberty to make choices of one's own without any restraint. Can we say these girls are free? Are they free from fear? Are they free to make choices for their own lives? Are they behind bars? No. Are they enslaved? No. But are they at liberty to make choices of their own for their own future? Not really. They live in a constant state of fear and anxiety for having their childhood taken from them at any time. Why? Just to be laden with responsibilities of womanhood, including childbearing and rearing, way before they're psychologically and physically ready for it. So what's happening? Child marriage and female genital mutilation. This is how it's generally defined. How's the prevalence in East Africa? Child marriage, Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia are said to be at the top, one among the top 20 countries, which is said to be or alleged to be top or hot spots for child marriage. How about FGM? This is how the statistics looks. It happens at universal level in Somalia and Djibouti, and followed by Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. So why does it happen? Why do parents? We love our children, but why? Don't they love their children? They do. Why does it happen? Child marriage, it happens for the reason of bride price, or what we call dowry. So it's like if you want to marry a girl in Africa, you're not supposed to buy her a ring and ask her to marry her. You have got to pay a lot of money and cattle, something, to her family. That's when you'll have the opportunity to get that girl. So this is what Juliet, a 14-year-old Ugandan girl, said. She wasn't ready, but her parents insisted, and they threatened her that they would deny her as their daughter unless she gets married. And she says it's because they're very poor and very greedy as well. And how much was offered? 1 million shilling. And Professor Andrea was this morning mentioning, what is the right price to be given for our children? There cannot be a right price, right? But these girls are being given away for cattle, for money, without their consent. It's just like a commodity, the very phrase of bride price. What does it indicate? Price indicates there is some sort of transaction. So they're more like commodities. And this is what parents think. I have paid bride price when I married my wife. I have 5 daughters, and it would not make sense for me not to be paid bride price and get rich. It's an opportunity to get wealth for the parents through their daughters. The other is economic security, which I chose to call child marriage, an African version of what is called trust fund in the Western world. Because they think like their girls are not worth for anything, because they think like their girls are not capable of becoming financially secure. While they can provide them with what they need, what they think is like the best way or the safest way is just to engage them with a man under the name of marriage so that he would take care of the girls. That's how they ensure their economic security for the girls. And FGM, religion, sociological reasons, there is what is called initiation or passage rite, which marks the transition from one stage to the next, which by itself is good, but FGM comes into picture as the right to adulthood, which marks the passage of a girl into womanhood at a very early age. And that's marked by FGM. And this is Nora, an Ethiopian girl. And she says, unless girls are caught, they will not be admitted to the next age group, which is the last group women aspire to get to. That's adulthood. There is right to birth, right to adulthood, right to eldership. So there is no way, and right to ancestorship. And there is no way women would think of getting into the group of the group of eldership and ancestorship, because that's completely close to women discrimination. So sexual reasons, premarital virginity and marital fidelity, that's one of the reasons FGM is as carried out, because uncircumcised girls are presumed to be sexually uncontrollable in that society. And the other is protection from sexual violence, and which works more in the case of the third type of FGM, which is infibulation, that's narrowing down of the vaginal opening of the girls. So they would be protected from sexual violence. So the way the society chooses to protect them against sexual violence is by narrowing them down. And this has been articulated by an elderly man in the Somalia region when he said, when a girl's honor is locked away, a thief cannot get to it. One circumcises to prevent dangerous situation like this from occurring. That's the path the society has taken. Economic reasons, bride price and economic security, I mentioned earlier. FGM is a source of income for circumcisers. That's how, I mean, it's like a valued or prestigious profession for those people who perform these FGM procedures, and it passes from one generation to the next. So it's a means by which they earn their income and support their families. What are the theoretical debates? Opponents definitely go for it's a medically harmful, over MGM, it's a medically harmful procedure. And the other thing is it's a violation of human rights, and feminists get into this group. So it's against the right to equality and non-discrimination against women. And there are proponents of this procedure too. And they see it from the perspective of cultural integrity. For Africans, their culture, or our culture, our tradition is part of our identity. So it's like, cultural relativists tend to say FGM is neither right nor wrong. It could be wrong if seen according to the Western standards, but could be right according to other societal values. So nobody can say it's right or wrong, and they mention the issue of plastic surgery, and this is what they say. And while they pass judgment on African people, the plastic surgeons of California are advertising a new service called designer vagina. So cutting is mutilation and barbaric in Africa, while vogue and fashionable in Hollywood. So this is one of the issues going on. So, isn't there a law to protect these kids? Let's see. There are international instruments, human rights instruments, regional instruments, human rights instruments. And guess what? All African countries have ratified at least one or more of these international instruments. What else? Domestic laws. Yes, there are domestic laws. Except for Eritrea and Sudan, all East African countries have criminalized the practice of FGM. And coming to childhood, the minimum age is said to be 18. In almost majority of the East African countries under consideration. Therefore, the prevalence of FGM is not for lack of the law. Then why is it still there? In addition to the law, there have been several NGO movements to end this practice. Could it be about law enforcement? What do you think? Could the law be a solution to every problem? Is it only about the law? If it is about the law, why does it have to why does the practice of FGM take place among immigrant communities in the U.S.? And in Europe, it happens. 1 minute. So what are the issues we have? Africanization versus Westernization. What do I mean by Africanization? Like I said, for Africans, our tradition, our values, customs are part of our identity. And nobody wants to give it up. And giving up this FGM practice means giving up our identity. That's how some see it. Most African society, members of the community see it. While human rights, right to equality, right against discrimination is Western-born, it's a Western ideology. So what are these people thinking? What are the members of the community thinking? So if I stop this practice, I am giving up my culture. I'm giving up my culture. I'm giving up my identity and surrendering to Western ideology. So that's why I said Africanization versus Westernization, medicalization versus criminalization. Opponents say it has to be penalized. It has to be criminalized in its entirety. While those who are in favor of medicalization say, well, let's bring a balance between cultural integrity and the health risks involved. So let's medicalize the procedure of FGM in this case as well. Poverty, which is the hidden agenda of economic prosperity at the cost of girls under the cover of tradition, which comes to child marriage. And FGM is also about child marriage because it's in order to qualify the girls for marriage. Therefore, what should be done? Let me leave you with these questions. Where do we all this girl suffering and but when the arguments for westernization, or again it's westernization versus Africanization, criminalization versus medicalization, as human beings in general, and as African Americans who have descended from the same continent there in particular. Thank you.
So we're very lucky this afternoon because we have a bonus panelist. Cedric Powell from the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law will be presenting on the dangers of neutrality, structural inequality, schools, and post-racial discourse. And then after Professor Powell, we'll have time for discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here. And I know you're tired, so I'm going to stick to my 50 minutes that I have before. Let's see if you're awake. I want to thank Professor Anthony Paul Farley, the 2014 Lassiter Distinguished Visiting Professor, Dean Brennan, and Dean Murphy. I'm really honored to be here with this distinguished group of colleagues, friends, and scholars from across the country. I started my teaching career with some of them, and we're not getting older, we're getting better. For my remarks today, I'm going to sort of reprise some of the themes that we've been talking about, because noticing all of the panels and the discussions that we've been having, we've basically been talking about structural inequality and the impact upon childhood on varying levels of degrees, like education, fear. And we've been talking about the fifth freedom, the fourth freedom, fear, freedom from fear. And so in my remarks today, dangers of neutrality, structural inequality, schools, and post-racial determinism, I'm going to try to reconceptualize Brown and talk about what it means in the context of a decision that is not being discussed that much this year, Milliken versus Bradley. It's the 40th anniversary of Milliken versus Bradley. We traditionally think of Brown versus Board of Education as a 14th Amendment decision. It eradicates the pernicious state mandate of separate but equal and begins the modern American polity. Some have argued that our modern conception of a racially pluralistic society begins with Brown versus Board of Education. In many ways, our country is just 60 years old, some have argued. Indeed, Joe Fegan, in his book Racist American, develops a devastating societal equation. Slavery plus Jim Crow equals 83% of our history. Thus, only 17% of our history as a country is free. This means that black children are consistently and negatively impacted by structural inequality. School segregation remains high. As of 2010, about 16% of whites are in schools where children of color are at least half of the school population, compared to more than 75% of African American and Latino children. Most children still attend schools that do not remotely achieve Brown's promise. Today I want to advance a brief critique of neutrality by reconceptualizing Brown as a decision that eradicates the fear of oppression. Professor Chuck Lawrence has envisioned Brown as a First Amendment decision because in eliminating the noxious doctrine of separate but equal, the court is essentially concluding that the state cannot engage in stigmatic speech that serves to not only exclude children from the American polity, but to dehumanize and psychologically dismember them as well. This is a year of many commemorative milestones. It is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. It is the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And while the decision has not received much fanfare, probably because it is not easily celebrated, it is the 40th anniversary of Milliken versus Bradley. America's racial history and the United States Supreme Court's race jurisprudence reflect unfulfilled hopes, dashed dreams, and incremental progress. One example of this sorry legacy is Milliken versus Bradley, perhaps one of the worst decisions rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court this past century. The 60th anniversary of Brown and the 40th anniversary of Milliken highlight a historical symmetry that is no coincidence. Brown is majestic and transformative, but it is also severely limited because the court never articulated a substantive remedial path to equality. Brown 1's eradication of separate but equal is immediately followed by Brown 2's all deliberate speed, which ultimately constitutionalized state inaction. So what are these neutral principles that I'm talking about? The neutral principles emanate from the fact that Brown has really two decisions, one about process and one about substance. We have been arguing about the substance over and over again, and people failed to realize that after Brown, things didn't magically change. It took 14 years really for the U.S. Supreme Court to get back into the business of articulating a substantive notion of equality, a full-blown structural inequality theory in its jurisprudence. In the Green decision, which invalidated a freedom of choice plan, which simply reinforced dual school systems. Swan in 1971, a broad remedial mandate for federal power to intervene when you had dual school systems. So in this three-year period, 14 years after Brown, one in 1968, Green, the broad remedial mandate in 1971, that's followed 3 years later by Milliken versus Bradley, a decision that creates an intent requirement, that values process over substance, that limits the power of federal courts to initiate integration efforts, that stops integration at the district line, and really leads to a series of decisions in the 90s that withdraws desegregation remedies from the table. And ultimately, it protects white privilege in the neighborhoods by drawing a ring around Detroit, making that core urban center totally segregated, and allowing white flight and the preservation of white privilege in the suburbs. It ultimately leads to Parents Involved in 2007, which elevates race neutrality and re-envisions Brown as an individualized right to achieve neighborhood schools. So this post-racial determinism plays itself out in a number of ways. First, it advances this notion of formalistic equality. In other words, we have already achieved a post-racial society. Everyone is equal, and anything that people of color receive is an unconstitutional benefit, apply strict scrutiny, unconstitutional. The de jure de facto distinction, the intent requirement, is constitutionalized so much so that unless you can clearly identify discrimination, the court will hold that any use of race-conscious remedies will be unconstitutional. I know about diversity, but we have Fisher, we have Grutter, we have a case like Chouette, last Supreme Court term, that talks about restructuring the political process so that people of color can't win, and that's constitutional as well. And finally, we have this notion of post-racial determinism. All of the things that I outlined really show that the court is predetermined to conclude that race-conscious remedies are unconstitutional. In other words, since race is no longer relevant to the court, whenever it is used, the state action involved will be held unconstitutional. Process is valued over substantive equality. So what would I suggest? In an article that should be published by the end of the year, I make a couple of suggestions. One is that we can look at Justice Thurgood Marshall's dissent in Milliken, which really argues forcefully for the eradication of artificial barriers between school districts and looking at consolidated school districts where everyone has a stake in the success of school children in the district. So formalistic equality should be rejected. Intentional discrimination should not be the evidentiary prerequisite for finding a systemic inequality. While race is indeed inherently suspect when it is being used for the right purpose, particularly to advance an equitable view of substantive equality under the 14th Amendment, the U.S. Supreme Court should affirm such efforts. Voluntary remedial efforts by school boards to substantively integrate schools by redrawing boundary lines to consolidate communities and resources should be affirmed by the courts. And post-racial determinism should be rejected. The 14th Amendment is not colorblind, so race should be considered to advance substantive equality. In one of the celebrations of the 40th anniversary of Milliken and the 60th anniversary of Brown, a leading scholar said this, An educational system operating under white supremacy in 1954 did not allow for black children to maintain their cultural brokers or to be respected by their white peers and educators. Integrating into a racist power system in which blacks were positioned as inferior provided little opportunity for equality and equity to occur in schools. With the removal of black teachers and administrators from black schools and their inability to teach in predominantly white schools, black youth were left to their own devices to define themselves as black achievers in racially hostile learning environments. While many youth developed skills to resist and overcome the oppression they experienced, a plethora of research indicates the psychological cost involved in the process. Situational self-doubt, rejection of black identity, or an overall sense of intellectual inferiority. Poorly planned efforts at integration still plague black children and communities today. The racism manifests itself in overt and subtle ways through educational policies and practices related to curriculum, discipline, funding, and the like. I remain hopeful that the intent of Brown can be realized during my children's lifetime, and that recognition of the equal part of separate but equal as unconstitutional is actualized. I am not optimistic about this without the destruction of a racist system that is at its core rotten and needs to be completely overhauled. We can do it. We can do it. We must meet our fears head on. That is the only way that our children will be free from fear. If education is the very foundation of good citizenship, then we must nurture our children so that their inclusion in the American polity has meaning. There should be no danger in their futures. Thank you. It's all about survival to me. It's part of living is fighting. And the only way that things will get better is if we keep pushing. The system that we're talking about is ingrained, it's entrenched. And racism now is a lot different than it was before. It always adapts, it's adaptable, it's consistent, and it's designed to preserve white privilege. So we have to adapt, and we have to confront it continually. I don't think we'll ever get total recompense from everything that has happened in this country. There was a story on NPR a couple of days ago that talked about how slavery actually made the United States what it is. And so when something is that sick and ingrained in our history, there's almost no way really to totally change it. But we have to keep pushing all the time.
And I think that, at least from the police perspective and shooting of these young boys, if there was some accountability, that would shut that down. Because we've already got the case law. We already got the training that tell them, they're supposed to pose a serious threat. That hasn't stopped. We've already got the training that goes on in these police departments. That hasn't stopped them. Because what hasn't happened yet is we've got, weeks and months before they're even, indicted by a grand jury, if they ever are. And so to the extent that there's no consequence, there's no benefit to them changing their behavior. So until we have some accountability, that piece of it isn't going to change. And that accountability comes from us in use of social media, in use of voting, in use of all of these things to shut their practices down and make them accountable for their actions.
I was just going to say, I think there's this Mexican proverb that says they tried to bury us, but they didn't know that we were seeds. And so, it's about growing and rising out of the circumstance and resisting at all angles, at all times. I think there are amazing stories of resistance during slave times and during the Middle Passage. I mean, during the most dark hours, there was resistance. And so I think keeping that resistance alive and not giving up that piece of it, and rising out of this place that we find ourselves in is a constant struggle that we should always be engaged in.
I would also add that some of the symbolism that our country represents, we need to destroy some of it, right? Some of the sort of heroes that we worship, right, with monuments and statues, all that, really needs to be rethought. The fact that many of us in this room learned or were taught that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery is a lie, right? It's the biggest lie that's been told. The 13th Amendment, which supposedly abolished slavery, did no such thing. It constitutionalized it. It made it legal for someone convicted of a crime. No slavery except if you've been convicted of a crime. And that's still on the books right now. As our country, we're, land of the free, home of the brave, yet we still have slavery as a constitutional issue. It's right there in the book. So some of this needs to be rethought and to shoot down some of these symbols like the 13th Amendment. Right? There should be no slavery. It just simply transferred who could own a slave. It went from private ownership to the government owning slaves. And so these are things that I think symbolically we need destroyed. Well, that would be just a part of it. I mean, there's no doubt. It's not just the war on drugs. It's the war on poverty and the war on terrorism, the war on this and that. We're a very sort of garrulous, belligerent society. And so that's definitely a part. What I'm trying to do is to distinguish the how from the why question, right? I'm trying to explain why, right, these tactics came into effect. And the war on drugs is one of the ways or the how this came about. But the war on drugs is very serious to think about, and on two counts I'll explain this. One is that the National Institute of Health says that populations do and sell illegal drugs in respect to their population size. So about 70-something% of illegal drug users and sellers are white. About 25% are African American, Latino. That's roughly the numbers. Okay, now let's look inside prison. Those numbers are flipped upside down. So again, it's a question of law enforcement and who's actually at war, right? Which communities are we at war? When I did my PhD at UC Santa Barbara, we were in the middle of a war on drugs, but they weren't busting the college kids. You could see a bong, like a pipe in their window seal. They weren't busting those kids. They were busting the Mexicans across the tracks. So war on drugs, it's a very selective war if we're in one. All right, ma'am. Always a pleasure.
Yes, always. Until next time.
So really, this is it, but it can't be it without just a kind of last word, right? So I'll try to make the last word happen within 1 minute, maybe 3. So freedom from fear on Black childhood and other dangers, right? I wanted this to be something of a paradox, right? Black childhood, where is it? What is it? How might we bring it about? A kind of unanswerable question if we only look to the history that we have lived as a nation, but maybe we can conjure out of our meeting some kind of magic that actually gets it done. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. I had a fancy ending. Can I do the fancy ending to the conference? We can't ask, I'm going to paraphrase James Baldwin, we can't ask how we feel about childhood. That kind of question can open the door on chaos, because what we really feel about childhood is involved with everything we feel about everything, about everyone, and about ourselves. So there are certain doors that we want to keep shut all the time. Anna Freud talks about the defenses of the id being carried about quietly and invisibly. The most we can do is try to reconstruct them. We never really see them in operation. We never see successful repression in operation. We become aware of it only after the fact because something seems to be missing. Where is black childhood? Where's my childhood? Where's black childhood? Finding it is what the conference has been about, and that means unpacking a paradox. It means, because this is one definition of paradox, saying that which must not be said if the form, the usual way of doing things, is to remain unbroken. But those forms are never immortal, right? They only seem so because we refuse to break with them. And this, I believe, has been a break with that form. Going back to Baldwin, to be African American or an American black is to be in a situation where you can't help but break form. Actually, I said you can't help but break form. Baldwin said, you're in a situation intolerably exaggerated of everyone who's ever found themselves part of a civilization that they could in no wise honorably defend. So blackness then involves a fundamental paradox when it's linked to the history of this country. We are in a situation we cannot defend because the situation undoes us. To be black then is to break form. It's to be a paradox, and paradox may be a sort of power, right? That's the whole point of reading Socrates, right? The paradox has been held by people who like language and talking and discourse to be a kind of power. If it's a power, then I think it's akin to black power, right? The power we have when we start talking about our own situation, despite all the paradoxes involved, which I think has been done, right? Harold Bloom. Anyone familiar with Harold Bloom? Kind of funny to bring him up now, isn't it, at the end? But he talks about the root word of form as meaning to gleam or to sparkle. But he says that poetic meaning doesn't just come from adherence to form. It comes from the breaking apart of form, the shattering of form. And that's what we've done. I think we have gleamed and sparkled, and it's been fantastic. And I think we have to keep going so it's not just a 4th of July fading out, but something more, something better, something that continues. So if we don't have your email address, at least, who registered? Registration involved emails, didn't it? So if we don't have your email address, come down here, sign this piece of paper, give me your email address so we can loop you in on anything else that we do, wherever we do it, somewhere, somehow in the future. Thank you. Oh, and here are the people who really put it together. Dean Brennan, Associate Dean Danny Murphy, Communications Director Tina Casey, Marianne Isaacs, April Brooks, both administrative support staff here, all of the UK folks like Jennifer Bird-Pollen and others who helped as moderators and just guided me around and guided us around today. So we have some prizes for the speakers, don't we? But let's give everybody, including yourselves, a round of applause. So you want to help me get these out? So I feel like a real Kentuckian now. This is for the speakers. Sorry we didn't have enough for everybody. You can ask them if they'll share. It's it smells like bourbon. It's Old Kentucky bourbon chocolates. So right, exactly, yeah. So exactly. You do not have to share these when you get home if you have children.
Do you get a nap?
Right, exactly. Right.
We can all take a nap.
Okay, all right, thanks.